do this. All right. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Again, thank you so much for coming. As I mentioned earlier, my name is Mark Volashin. I'm the Deputy Secretary of State for Elections. Appreciate, again, all of you taking time out of your schedule to come here to Las Vegas today. For those of you that are out of town or from out of town, and those of you joining us, again, via Zoom, promise we won't hold it against you in the long run. Run a show for today. We're going to start with some introductions here in a moment. I do want to remind everybody, if you haven't signed in the back, please do so. It's helpful for us. Aaron and the team have a contact list, an email listserv that we want to make sure is updated to reflect accurately everybody that's going to be part of the Elections Integrity Task Force. But we'll get into that here in a minute. So again, just to back up, Mark Volashin, Deputy Secretary for Elections. I work for Secretary Aguilar up in Carson City, primarily, but down here today for the presentation. I'll turn it over to my colleagues to my left and right. And then if we can, we'll start in the back left for me, and then we'll kind of work our way, just if you guys don't mind introducing yourselves so we know who's who in the room, and what agency you're part of, and maybe your title too, just so that we're all kind of on the same page.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Murphy Abear. I am the Chief Deputy for the Secretary of State's office.
Hi, everyone. I think I've met most of you in the past. My name is Erin Houston. I'm the Deputy Secretary of State for Securities. The reason I'm here, because normally my division deals exclusively with violations of NRS 90, which involves securities, investment products, securities fraud, kind of American greed type investigations and compliance. We also lead a team of criminal investigators who have been the primary investigators for election violations over the last several years, and they are in this room as well. Thank you for attending, gentlemen, and I will turn it back over to Mark.
Perfect, thank you. So if we could, again, and I know we have just a slightly late arrival, but we'll start we're going to do introductions. So not to put you on the spot, you did walk into the back left corner of spot, so you kind of brought this on yourself. If you could please just a name, agency that you work for, though I suspect we guess, and then your title as it relates to the Elections Integrity Task Force, and then we're just going to kind of work our way across.
Yeah, Captain Mike.
With the Secretary of State's Office of Criminal Investigators, I'm part of the team that will be investigating the elections.
Todd Tumbleson, Criminal Investigator with the Nevada Secretary of State's Office. Jeremy Bunker, Secretary of State's Office, Criminal Investigator.
Pete DeMaio, Criminal Investigator for the Secretary of State's Office.
Good morning, Barney Brucken, North Las Vegas Police Department, Captain and Representative for them.
Good morning, Patrick Halligan, Lieutenant with Nevada State Police.
Good morning, Janice Galang, Intelligence Manager for Southern Nevada Counterterrorism Center.
Jody Carl, I'm an analyst in emergency management and critical infrastructure out of the Southern Nevada Counterterrorism Center.
Norman Sorokian, I'm an FBI agent. I'm the FBI Selection Crimes Coordinator for Nevada.
Charlotte Jarliquer, also with the FBI and the special agent that works with Armin from the cyber perspective.
Anthony Tran, I'm an analyst with the FBI.
Jacob Ritz, analyst with the FBI. Yes.
Edgar Ponda, I'm a Deputy Attorney General.
Greg Ott, also with the Attorney General's Office, representing the Secretary of State.
Emily Espinosa, also with Attorney General, representing the Secretary of State.
Kenneth Hawk, Sergeant with Clark County Public Safety.
Good morning, I'm Matthew Rashbrook. I work in the Attorney General's Office. Also, I work in the criminal prosecution sector.
Craig Newby, First Assistant Attorney General, Nevada Attorney General's Office.
Sean Bowen, Acting Chief of Investigations for the Attorney General's Office.
Good morning, Angela Grant, Supervising Criminal Investigator with the agency.
Perfect. Thank you all. And again, I know one, there's some folks on Zoom. We won't ask them just yet. But two, again, just as a reminder, maybe I haven't mentioned this before, but we are this is being recorded. It's going to be not public link on YouTube, so that we can provide this to you, so that if you do have counterparts or other folks that join later on in the calendar year as we get closer to the general election, that you think may benefit from this presentation, again, we'll make sure that you have that available to you later on. Okay, let's see if this works. Broadcasting, could you please put the presentation up? It did work. Excellent. I know, right?
That's good government right there.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Okay, so this is the meeting of the Elections Integrity Task Force. Here's the agenda so you can kind of see what we're going to be talking about over roughly the next couple hours. It's about 60 slides, I'll be honest, just so you kind of know what you're looking at. Again, while it's intended to be a little bit of a presentation, of course, again, I do encourage you all, if you have questions, please raise your hand, interrupt, those sorts of things. You don't have to come up to the table and state and spell your name or anything like that, but just kind of holler out your question if you don't mind, because I suspect if you're thinking it, others are as well. And it's probably indicative that I'm not being clear or that the slide was probably poorly written or something. So please don't hesitate to ask questions. But again, this is meeting the Elections Integrity Task Force. We'll talk a little bit about the history and the components, go over some of the election crimes. Again, for some of you, and I need a quick show of hands, has anybody not come to an Elections Integrity Task Force meeting before? Perfect. Enough of you that I appreciate both the recidivism as well as the new joins. So thank you all for coming and not being fully scared away. I'll give a little bit of history of what we've been facing and kind of why the importance of the Elections Integrity Task Force has really kind of shown its merit over the last couple of years. And then lastly, because it's not fun to just focus on kind of concerns and these bizarre election crimes that may or may not happen, we'll talk about mitigation, because again, it's important that we collectively don't just think about what could happen, but also how we're going to help to ensure the rights of voters. And then lastly, we'll close on a little bit of the way forward so that we're all on the same page about what the next 12 to 18 months looks like, give or take. Okay, there we go. A little bit of delay. Good to know. Okay, so the history of the Elections Integrity Task Force, for those of you guys that aren't aware, originally created back in 2008 under the Secretary of State at the time. The idea at the time was the problem, so to speak, that was trying to be solved was that elections crimes are kind of nuanced, that when they happen, oftentimes they only happen on very specific days every other year, maybe. And that the individuals responsible for addressing allegations of election crimes, honestly, at the time, didn't really communicate too much. And there was kind of this siloing effect where state, local, and in some cases federal partners, all well-intentioned, trying to do their best, would address crimes in either different non-consistent manners or weren't really clear on who was going to take over or kind of cover something or even what was necessarily a crime. So Secretary at the time, Ross Miller, had an idea to put together essentially a working group, right? To be perfectly clear, and this is something I think is worthy of stating up front, like this is not, like you are not coming under the command of a joint force in which the Secretary of State now has direct tasking authority over you. Like that is not what this is. But really, it's a collaboration of different organizations to make sure that, one, there's a leveling so that we're all clear and on the same page about who's responsible for doing what is what we're looking for, right? Like what are the current crimes and if there's been any changes since the last election cycle, and there have been, not only in national trends, but in what's allowable under our state laws. Again, we're all on the same page is really much the focus of that effort. You can see, again, a list of the agencies that have been involved historically that continues to expand. And I think, frankly, that's the right answer. Because ultimately, again, we're not talking about, just Clark County voters. We're not talking about City of Henderson voters. We're talking about the entirety of the Nevada electorate. So what exactly, in a nutshell, is it that we do? The EITF collectively and in our own responsibilities in our own lanes, of course, investigates those complaints related to an allegation of state and federal law. Again, interesting to note that oftentimes complaints that may come to each of us may fall into the jurisdiction of another. And again, it kind of centralizes an understanding of who's responsible for what and really helps, again, our situational awareness across the state. A wide range of different topics that we'll cover when it comes to the actual crimes that we're looking at. So it is also, and I want to be very clear, isn't just limited to, for example, enforcing one specific, the whole point is not just to prevent somebody from voting or attempting to vote twice, right? Like it's the full spectrum of ensuring that voters, again, have their rights and that they're able to execute them, but also all the other weird stuff that comes up, campaign finance and other things, have an opportunity to get addressed as well. Back in 2017, again, when the federal government designated elections infrastructure as critical infrastructure, there's also been a cyber component as well that we've incorporated, which again also kind of continues to expand as we look to the future also. Okay, so the components and kind of diving into again, trying to take it from a big picture into kind of a tangible, like what should you expect? During election day, again, it started off only being during election day that we would meet as a task force. And this is again back in 2008. It has since grown so that in addition to a meeting during the hours that the polls are open on election day from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., having representatives again both in Carson City and Las Vegas, in the Capitol as well as in the Secretary's office here in Las Vegas. We also now offer this in-person kind of a start to the election cycle as part of a leveling brief. Moving forward, outside of the 2 in-person meetings that we will conduct on election day, both in June and November, we'll also do virtual updates. As we get closer to the primary, again, we'll all hop onto a Teams call. That one typically 15 to 30 minutes at most, where we validate recall rosters, or not recall, I guess, but like contact rosters. We validate or provide an update if there have been nationwide trends or regional trends, things that maybe folks at SNCTC have seen, or things at the FBI, or even that I've heard from my counterparts as the state election directors across the other states, just so we can say, hey, here's what's going on. There was another state that had a primary 2 months before ours, and this is what happened, so that we're all aware of those sorts of updates as well. But those virtual updates, again, helpful for the again, understanding and recognizing the change in personnel across the state, but also, again, for those updates. In addition to those meetings, again, right, and just so that you're clear on kind of what this looks like otherwise, throughout the next year, and really it's kind of a day-to-day thing is part of the job. But I talk with the county and city election officials, our 17 county clerks and registrars, and the 18 city clerks. As we continue to move forward, right, they will continue to feed me information that I will bring, in some cases, to you all for awareness. Again, spikes in kind of weird things happening in one county or another that could possibly bleed over into another adjoining county or jurisdiction. Again, all part of the leveling. We also get injects from the public. The public have a process by which they can file an election integrity violation report. It's a fairly straightforward document that simply captures the information of the complainant to make sure that we understand what they're assuming to be a concern. And depending on the trends that we identify across those EIVRs, we may have updates for you as well. And some folks call in as well. But yeah, the goal here is, as you can see on the bottom of the slide, not just one county or another, but really across the state. And making sure that again, even if it's not your county that you have to worry about necessarily, still that you're kind of aware of it. Similar sort of discussion here in regards to what that information looks like as we receive those injects from the public, from other states, or from some of our partners here on the EITF. Really the cycle that we look at that sort of receive the allegation. A lot of these things will come directly to the Office of the Secretary of State. Again, through those EIVRs, phone calls, or otherwise. There's an assessment and prioritization process that we'll talk about on the next slide before communicating it, right? In some cases, if it's a county-specific issue, we may reach out specifically to that clerk or registrar, to that local law enforcement agency to make sure they're aware of it. Again, this is really just an information piece of it, depending on what we receive, so that they can conduct that investigation. And then ultimately, we simply ask for a little bit of feedback, like, did we give enough info? Was it not timely? Is there a different person we should be passing that to help facilitate those timely investigations? So again, kind of pretty straightforward. So here's, when I talk about that prioritization and the analysis piece, I think this is worthy of note, right? We realize that there's a big spectrum, and you'll see, you're going to kind of get it whether you like it or not, I think, here in a minute. what exactly we're talking about when it comes to election crimes. But there's a lot, and there's a different approach that really needs to be taken across the board, depending on the nature of it. That tier one, right, the top row on the chart you're looking at. These sort of high priority Title 24 violations, right? Title 24, of course, is the 9 chapters of state law that make up our elections chapter. A high priority violation of an election law. If it's time sensitive, that's what we're talking about. In the most basic, somebody being denied access to the ballot box, right? That's something where somebody's calling from a parking lot on election day, possibly, or during early voting, unable to vote. That's their window to do it. If it's not addressed immediately, they lose the ability, right? Polls close at 7 p.m. If you haven't voted by then, better luck next time, unfortunately. Those sorts of high priority ones get flagged and addressed with a great sense of urgency. There are some that are easy, right? Straightforward ones, confusion about certain things. In that top right box, right? The complex, time-sensitive issues that require extensive research, analysis, discussion, oftentimes and may likely result in a criminal referral. That sort of complex problem, again, is worthy of getting addressed. And again, if it's a high effort, 6+ hours is kind of the estimate that we use. Those sorts of things, the sooner you get going on that, the better for everybody. And again, the communication piece, pretty essential. You can see it's a tiered approach, right? I will tell you that the vast majority of the issues that we get identified to us oftentimes are tier 4, quite frankly, where it's not a violation of Title 24 or other statute or ordinance. Really, we kind of flavor those with those are voter education opportunities, right? When somebody calls and says, "Oh my God, this is crazy. I got a mail ballot. I didn't even ask for it." Crimes. Well, actually, no, like you must have come from a state where you had to request it. Turns out here in Nevada, by our state law, we're required to send it to every active registered voter. So it's not a crime, it's a voter education opportunity. Those sorts of things. Again, the vast majority of the complaints that we get are those specifically. And again, it's equally important for us to address, and because while there's oftentimes this confusion about the nature of the state law, is still very important that we're educating voters and also getting to the root of why they think it's a concern. There's oftentimes outreach adjustments that we'll do if there's kind of a spike in confusion for one reason or another. Okay, so who do we support with this EITF process? Ultimately, like I mentioned, the 17 clerks and registrars are 18 city clerks. And really the entirety of the state. And this is something that I know you all take very seriously and that we also, hold near and dear. But the reality is that it's not a single voter in a single county. What we're talking about here are the decisions that impact our state and federal leadership that have long-lasting repercussions. And therefore, again, when we talk about the sensitive and critical nature of voting rights, it's no small thing. And again, this collaboration, this team that you're part of with the Elections Integrity Task Force, again, reflects also, I would argue, your agency's recognition of that and an understanding of the importance of that sort of communication. But why, right? Like, why are things changing over the last handful of years, right? To be clear, and looking back even just over a little bit of state history, right? Across our 17 counties after the 2020 election cycle, the first county election official quit in December of 2020. Others have since, again, left office. So we're at a point where still out of about 17, about 11 of them have quit or retired and been replaced. What does that mean? Well, there's going to be less experience in recognizing potentially illegal activities. We're thankfully at a point where the clerks that are in office have been so since the 2022 election. And I'll note now, just so that you're aware, but our 15 elected clerks are all on the ballot in 2026. So we are really at kind of a high watermark potentially when it comes to their experience levels over the last couple election cycles. Many of them were appointed before the 22 election cycle that they were running in and ultimately elected into office. So some of them have administered the 22 primary, 22 general, 24 primary in general, along with the presidential preference primary, and then also the 26, or now again, the 24, 22, 24, and now that they're starting the 26 cycle. So again, pretty solid experience. Turnover at the county level with their staff, though, continues to be a challenge, right? County government may not pay as much in some cases as the private sector. So retaining staff, especially in kind of a high stress environment, is continuing to be a challenge. And I'm sure is no different for you all. But that also kind of contributes to the concerns. The increased workload is also not something that I think that we can kind of put aside or ignore. When you administer an election that is purely in-person voting only, or maybe like Nevada had up until 2020, no excuse absentee ballots where anyone could ask for, but it wasn't for everybody. It's really two entirely separate processes. So the work that goes into an in-person election is independent from what is done for a mail ballot election. And again, that increased workload, again, recognizing that a lot of the counties didn't necessarily get additional staff, continues to put a pretty heavy burden on them. With more work, again, with not necessarily any extra time. The nationwide conversation around stolen elections. I'm not sure if any of you have heard any of that over the last couple of years, but it continues to be a part of our national discussion. Despite it, I think this is probably also a great time to say it, despite it not being true, and despite the fact that both the secretary currently and previous administrations have dug into and reviewed every allegation to get to the root cause and understand allegations, especially through the EITF, the bottom line is, while there are certainly people with both terrible judgment and just an incredible sense of initiative to do crimes, the bottom line is like the effectiveness of somebody attempting to vote twice simply isn't there. It happens. People do bad things and find creative ways to do so. But again, it's at a much smaller scale than I think people are aware of. Anyway, that being said, overall, there's just been a collectively greater risk when it comes to the electoral process. And this task force, again, also helps address and mitigate a lot of those issues.
Okay, I'm going to go over some of the recent successes from the EITF task force collaboration. One thing I wanted to mention that's not on this slide, because I'm going to go through some of the cases that we've been able to investigate successfully, and most of them have been prosecuted through the Office of the Attorney General. Thank you, Matt. And then several, in the past, we've also had cases investigated and prosecuted through the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Nevada. But one thing I wanted to mention as a really good example of a success from the EITF, from my perspective, in the 2024 general election, we're all sitting in the same room, law enforcement agencies, attorneys from various offices, myself, Mark, we're there sharing information and able to respond collectively to members of the public who call in with a concern. Well, one person called, I think it might have been Clark County, and said, hey, I'm really concerned that this election is being stolen because I see several mail trucks in the Albertsons parking lot and they're sort of nervously moving boxes around. Well, we just so happen to have an individual from the USPS, Office of the Inspector General, who was in the room with us. He was able to call down to whatever, mail facility was nearby that Albertsons and ascertained that what was actually happening was they were just delivering packages that had, a 2-day turnaround and had to be hand delivered more quickly. And we were able to let that person know, no, there is nothing nefarious happening. It's just the standard practice, and get some legitimate answers out to members of the public, which I personally feel is the real reason that the Election Integrity Task Force is helpful, not just to Nevadans, but to our agencies as well. We also find information that leads to investigations such as those that are detailed on the screen above you. Just to kind of walk through them quickly without taking a lot of time. Craig Frank, that's one that was actually investigated through the FBI. I believe that FBI did this case and it was investigated through, prosecuted by the U.S. Attorney's Office. He did vote twice in the same election. And that was back in 2019 before things got a little bit more heated. The Donald Hartle case is a perfect example of a successful EITF collaboration. We did hear about this case through somebody who made an anonymous complaint and also made an anonymous complaint to somebody within the EITF task force. He voted you may remember this story. He he went on TV and said, somebody voted my wife's ballot. She passed away in 2016. I'm disgusted. Well, through our investigation, we were able to determine that it was actually him who voted his wife's ballot, and he was prosecuted. He wound up pleading guilty to a gross misdemeanor, but it was really important to be able to demonstrate to the public that this allegation was incorrect, and he had not actually, his wife's ballot had not been voted by somebody who snatched her ballot from the mail or something like that. Mark White was another double vote from 2020. Same with James Wafer is a person who voted using his father's ballot. His father had passed away in 2018, and he felt strongly about who should be president. So he took the opportunity to vote the ballot that his father, that had come in the mail for his father. Since that time, Mark has worked very, very closely with the counties to make sure that their ballot, I'm sorry, what's the term for their people on the list of people who get the ballots, is the voter roll?
Oh, yeah. Sorry, yeah.
That their voter rolls are updated, and that they're working closely with the Social Security Index to make sure that every individual who passes away is automatically removed from the voter roll. But at the time, James Wafer Jr. voted James Wafer Sr.'s ballot, and he was found and charged. John Dixon from 2020, he also voted twice. Karen Lemaire from 2020 general, she voted 2022 general, I apologize, is another double voter. I believe she was from Utah and Nevada and voted in both states. And then Robert Stewart III from the 2024 primary did the same thing as well. He pled guilty to a lesser charge and was sentenced to community service. So far, we've referred about 35 cases to the Nevada Attorney General's office for potential prosecution. It takes a long time for the cases to be investigated and then worked over at the Attorney General's office. And in the course of the discussion about whether to prosecute, I'm sure there's a lot that goes into whether it's a case that deserves to be prosecuted, because we send them over if we just see any indicia of two names on the same, two of the same name on different ballots. But it is a very small fraction of the overall voters in the state of Nevada.
Which is an excellent point, Aaron, and very much appreciate that. I was thinking even just a minute ago, right? When you think of all the election integrity violation reports that we get, also, we had over 950 in 2025 alone, right? It wasn't even an election year for our state, but we still had people reporting questions, allegations of what somebody said, hey, back in 2018, I did this. And they're like, noted, let me send that to somebody because I take elections integrity very seriously. And then it would come over to our office. So you figure almost 1,000, and even still, and not election year, but again, there are some that ultimately got turned into a criminal investigation, but not nearly as many as maybe you would think. Oh, there you go. He's back. Good. I did ask broadcasting, by the way. I know we got a number of folks on the Zoom call, but it was in webinar mode. I was told, so I'm trying to change that so that the folks that did call in can also interact and ask questions as well. So we'll see if that happens. Cool. Okay, so moving on though. So I want to start, and we're going to talk a little bit about sort of the common election crimes. Crimes in this case, right, in quotes, because a lot of what we're going to talk about at first, like, aren't in fact actually crimes. There's a concern, and again, I think it's a great concern for some people, but when folks move to Nevada, and we have a very transient population, right? When we've looked at our voter rolls, somewhere between 20 to 23%, I think it was, of our voter rolls had individuals that changed at least a mailing or residential address once over a 2-year cycle, right? So you think like almost a quarter of our population is moving. That's huge compared to other states. And when we have that, right, it's not just folks that are moving from Clark to Nye and back and forth, but folks coming from other states coming to Nevada, they bring with them an understanding of their state laws. In some cases, it's a very elaborate understanding. In some cases, they don't have a clue of what they were doing back there either. And as a result, when they come to Nevada and they experience our elections, oftentimes we get allegations about this is going on, and it's simply not the case. There's questions about the First Amendment considerations versus civil rights that come up a lot. Whether somebody's protesting or has is doing something passionately and exercising their First Amendment right, which they absolutely are allowed to do so. But somebody else is now saying, I feel intimidated because that person's doing his thing on the other side of the parking lot and those sorts of things. So again, there's kind of these I don't say issues to address, but again, in some cases, it's helping folks understand what the First Amendment means and how that works. There's perception versus reality things about like Aaron's. I think it's a great example. Everyone around an election cycle after early voting starts to notice things happening around them, right? Like people doing things and like trucks stopping in parking lots, right? That I'd never noticed trucks stopping in parking lots before. So like they assume that because that's near a polling place, that's going to, maybe there's something nefarious and they'll report that. So a lot of these things, again, truly is just a matter of understanding. I mentioned that the Title 24 is, again, our 9 chapters of law, and we're not going to talk through every one of them. I don't want you to stand up and leave en masse right now. We're going to cover some of the specific statutes, but I want to point out that, again, the reason that I threw these on here is like 9 chapters, like they're not easy. Like it's not, again, those of you that have experience kind of poking around and looking at laws, it's really hard to read some of these. And some of them were written back in the 1960s, for example, haven't been touched since. Others get updated pretty regularly. So, understanding how they overlap, understanding how 293C that talks about city elections, kind of works with 293, which is kind of the broader elections chapter, and the UACAVA section that are the federal law for the Uniform and Overseas Citizen Absentee Voting Act. How is that different from 293D and our state specific statutes? It gets complicated very quick, right? And so when folks do reach out and say, hey, I've got a question or concern, like we give them nothing but grace because we get it. Like if you're confused by Title 24 as a starting point, okay, good. Then we can work with you and we'll help explain things. There's also, again, numerous federal laws. And I took the liberty of just throwing the acronyms at the bottom there. So you get your Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, Uniform and Overseas Citizen Absentee Voting Act, National Voter Registration Act, Help America Vote Act, the Military and Overseas Voter Enhancement, I think it is, and then the Electoral Count Reform Act, right? Those are just some of the ones codified in 52 USC and elsewhere that talk about elections. Equally dense, right? If you get the book from LexisNexis, right? The federal law one that talks about elections, it's like a 3-point font. Like it's not even funny. They don't even mask it. It's like 1,000 pages and still like the tiniest font imaginable. And it's also layered with all the different Supreme Court cases and otherwise that provide context and clarity to those federal acts. So it gets very elaborate very quickly. So again, when we hear about crimes, the allegations, sometimes it's confusion. Sometimes, like I mentioned, it's from, what somebody experienced or saw or did in another state when they lived there. And increasingly, it's what you hear on social media. When I talk to my other state election directors, like the big joke when it comes to discussing elections at the national level is when elections in one state, elections in one state. Like I don't have a clue how Arizona does their elections. I mean, I probably can speak to the federal component piece, but again, truly across the 50 states, DC and the territories, everybody has found a unique flavor that represents the will of their electorate as expressed through their legislatures and, governors and other processes. And it ain't the same way here. So it just adds to the confusion and really results in a lot of what we've been seeing and hearing. Some other examples of these are, I think, some other perception ones, right? If somebody's giving a ride to the polls, again, I want to stress these aren't crimes. I mean, there's always the component where it could be, right? Like if you twist the scenario around enough, but these are some of the common things that we get, calls about, whether or not somebody's able to get time off to work or, providing information. That's kind of the electioneering piece. We get calls about folks just passing out information out in the public. The get out the vote is a big one, right? Bus loads of people coming from out of state to do something here. Like to be election observers is perfectly fine, right? When you talk about election observers as opposed to poll workers, as opposed to election official, right? Those definitions have utility also. Anyone can be an observer, right? The way our state laws are set up, again, we have people routinely from overseas come and observe our country's elections, and from even like California come into Nevada to observe our elections. Like that happens. It's totally acceptable. But when folks see somebody show up to the polls that is watching, oftentimes they'll report that. Different for being a poll worker, right? There's certain requirements. You got to be a registered voter in Nevada to be a poll worker. Again, and you'll find that we don't have, individuals who are citizens of other countries being poll workers, because again, you got to be a resident and there's other requirements you have to fill to be a voter, and therefore a poll worker. But again, all over, right? It's just, there's a lot of different people with a lot of different roles and not a lot of clarity, right? Like we don't have, big, purple hats for observers to wear, but then a poll worker wears a big green jacket. That might be helpful, but we don't today, right? So as a result, when you see people in a crowded, large polling place and not understanding how it works, it can cause confusion, and then, of course, in some cases, concern, and then reporting. The guns one, I think, is worthy of note. Again, and we're going to take a minute to talk about guns in the polls, because again, this is something that we get a lot of calls about, and I think probably for most of you, this is probably pretty clear. But at the end of the day, there isn't a prohibition on guns in polling places outside of certain other statutes that we'll talk about here in a moment. Is what it is. Again, we get calls about that, and again, making sure that we're protecting Second Amendment rights as equally as we are First Amendment, as equally as we are, voting rights, can be a balance, especially for local law enforcement who routinely get those calls first and foremost. So, of the three types of polling places, this is also, I think, important to note, because even if your jurisdiction didn't have polling places that maybe were in a school last election cycle, I will tell you that those locations are changing more rapidly now than they had in previous decades. And I know while Washoe and Clark are both working to finally codify and finalize their list of polling places, there are going to be some pretty significant changes across our state in locations. That by itself creates headaches, right? Somebody, and this happens on almost every election day, someone will show up to a library and say, this place used to be a polling place, it's not anymore, I didn't catch it in the news, or why, and assume something possibly negative from it. We'll get calls about that too. But otherwise, with guns, again, we try to clarify as best we can and point them towards the statutes, but there's always so much nuance to it, of course, right? Whether it's private or people routinely will cite, this actually comes up on the next slide, we try to use public buildings as much as possible. Sometimes we use private. Increasingly, the private buildings don't want to be involved as a polling place. Folks will say, hey, wait a minute, I thought, if I just kind of tack a sign up, does that do a thing? And again, every one of these, unfortunately, is uniquely specific. And terribly nuanced, but also, again, if somebody is citing the presence of guns in a polling place as being a concern, it's something that warrants immediate attention, and then also, trying a very delicate hand to make sure that you adjudicate it and help them through that process properly. A common question we get, right, when somebody calls and says, hey, it's election day, I wanted to vote, but I see a number of folks outside the building exercising their Second Amendment rights. What do I do? People have said, well, why can't you just tell them to vote the mail ballot that was sent to them? So under Nevada law, if you opt out from receiving a mail ballot, you have to do that 60 days before the election, and you can't opt back in after you've opted out. If you do opt in, you're opting in for the next election cycle. So oftentimes we'll have individuals who go to the polls who opted out of getting a mail ballot, and that's part of the reason why they're there in person, which again adds a little bit to the complexity of it, but it also highlights, I think, the importance of understanding how our laws work. We have a handful of schools. I'll also say it's kind of a diminishing number of schools that are asking to be polling places, in part because of the concerns related to possible political violence or otherwise. Thankfully, when there is a school, again, nobody brings the guns. That's kind of a separate conflict. But again, it happens. Bottom line, again, important to understand and look at the polling places that you have across the county, making sure that you understand which ones are public, private, schools, and otherwise, so that you're ready to address it given the urgency in the location. So that we are, I dropped the quotes on this one, right, specifically. So we're going to start talking about some actual election crimes, like things that happened that people have attempted to do or have done in the past. You know, again, this is also part of what we've seen in the past is that when we do get it, whether it's an election integrity violation report, that EIVR, or a phone call, or when you get a first report, routinely, that first report, like I think is always the case, is pretty far off from really what the problem is. We have folks that are, again, well-intentioned, trying to cite statute, and they pull up the wrong statutes. We've had people quote statutes from other states and said it was illegal, which may be true in the other state, but not in our state, obviously. So I mentioned that also because, like, what we found is that part of the reason we have the form that we do is that we're trying to get as much information out of the individuals as possible so we can understand the nature of the allegation. Routinely, again, that'll open a conversation that leads to diving into, like, wait, what? Oh, okay, here's the issue, that we can kind of help frame it ourselves as we start that investigation process with our civil investigators before determining whether or not what tier it ends up being, going back to that previous slide. Again, the illegal in other states, but not here, again, frankly, is one of the biggest things we've found. But you can see on the bottom of the slide, and I guess I shouldn't have been talking too much smack about a 2-point font. You probably can't read that yourselves. You will get the slides afterwards, but this is generally where the unlawful acts and penalties comes out in 293. It's 293-700. It's NRS 293-700 to 840. And what we're going to do over the next little bit is kind of talk through a select number of these. You know, really started with some of the more common ones. But first.
Okay, me again. One of the things that we were going to mention really quick, and I'll keep this brief so Mark can get going through the election crime, the typical election types of crimes. But one thing to keep in mind when you're going through your investigations, if you are law enforcement and you're investigating anything that is an allegation of any of the Title 24 chapters, the investigations are exactly the same as any other criminal investigation that you would conduct normally. Document every single thing that you can in your report and be as detailed as possible. The slide gives a really good example. If you are investigating someone who may have been tampering with voting equipment, then do what you can to document the intent for that tampering, so you can potentially prove that they were doing so with the intent of influencing the outcome of the election. So be as detailed as you can when you're going through the investigation itself, and then get as many statements as you can from all involved parties. A lot of times we see people who are being charged or they're being investigated for electioneering, which means you would need to talk to every single person you could who witnessed this conduct and the behavior, and the people who placed the signs. Let me figure, is it this next one? Sorry. Right, so an electioneering case is a perfect example where you would want to take as many photographs as possible. Obviously, you have to be very careful about photographing so you don't get people's ballots in your evidence for other voters who are not involved in this investigation. But the best thing you can do is take photographs of the signage itself, get photographs of where the car was parked that the signage may have been placed on, and also get the distance marker for electioneering cases. We had a lot of cases where we were having a hard time proving that they knew that they were not supposed to vote twice in the same election, because there's this sign that tells you, that you're aware of the fact that you're not allowed to vote twice in the same election. So we were always asking investigators to get a picture of that sign in the polling place if possible, so we would have that for the file. Just a best practice. So if you can, try to take a picture where the attempted double vote took place of the signage itself. And then if possible, get additional information. We do have 7 post-certified peace officers, actually 8 post-certified peace officers And they do investigate 293, 294A. Those cases, by and large, come from the elections team, the civil investigators who refer cases to our team. We don't investigate them ourselves, meaning we don't go out and look for evidence that a crime has occurred. They do get referred to our division, which is how we find out about them. And they're not first responders. So if there's an emergency at a polling place or there's a situation that requires a response from peace officers, it would not be the Nevada Secretary of State's peace officers who will go and handle some sort of crisis situation. It's important to always call local law enforcement to go to any sort of a scene where there's a situation that requires a peace officer response. But they are a very valuable source of information as subject matter experts. Our chief, Gary Barboa, could not be here today, so unfortunately you have to listen to me instead, but his contact information is up on the screen. Gary Barboa, 702-486-2597. And the Criminal Investigations Division can be reached by calling 702-486-2440. That's the Securities Division line, so you'll get a response from somebody from the Securities Division. They'll route them to usually the investigator of the day. So you may need to say specifically, I'd like to speak to somebody on criminal investigations or Gary Barboa. You can also ask for me, Erin Houston, and I will make sure that you get the information you need. Oh, you have it? Okay.
Perfect. Nice, thank you. And and that's again, it highlights a great point, right? Because we've had investigators show up trying to assist, on a call. And did you know that electioneering relates to a sign that's 100 feet away from the polling place? Like, if you wouldn't know that intuitively, maybe you didn't even notice the sign. Now, I hope when you go to the polls, if you vote in person, that's fine. If you do, if you don't, that's fine too. But like, now you'll look for the signs and be like, is that really 100 feet? Like, again, awareness of this is, I think, a starting point, which is, again, a big part of what we're trying to do here today. Also, a good opportunity for me to stress that, following this presentation, again, the primary is not tomorrow. General is not the day after, thankfully. If there's a similar discussion or level of training or awareness you'd like us to provide to others in your agencies, very much open to it as well. Again, please just reach out, but there's a number of resources that we'll talk about here towards the end of the slides that we're trying to assist in that, overcoming that challenge, frankly, of understanding the nuance of election law that really only applies every other year. And really, 45 days before an election when the mail ballots get sent out, but then only 2 weeks before for election day, but then really only 12 hours on election day. It's a very small window of time. There's just a lot to be aware of. So any way that we can help assist your teams, we are eager to do so. Looking back at these slides. So electioneering, what is this exactly? Campaigning for and against, candidates, ballot questions. Again, by itself, that process sounds like something that should be allowed. When we talk about electioneering, we're really talking about it occurring in certain locations that it shouldn't be done, right? Specifically close to the polls. It gets interesting nowadays too, because folks are like, well, wait a minute, if I'm getting a mail ballot in the mail and I'm carrying around my mail ballot, isn't that essentially my voting location? Shouldn't there be 100-foot bubble around me as I walk, holding up my ballot? No, like, obviously, like, the law's got to kind of draw a line somewhere. But really, and you'll see that because of the way the statutes are structured, not saying it's as complicated as it necessarily could be, because I don't want everyone to think that's a challenge. But you can see here at the top of the slide, right, that there's different standards for election day and early voting. That if you're talking about, talking to people, it's, 293.740 sub 2, but that only covers early day and election day voting. But if it's signs and other things, then it's in 361. So like the fact that it's all kind of spread out, almost comical, but again, important because there are different standards and different requirements. And things that maybe are not supposed to happen on one day that can on another day, which really doesn't help the matters at all. The bottom right in the italics there, again, making sure that we clarify also private residences. There's less and less, like when we talk about private residence now, we're really or private locations. We're really talking about like like malls. It's sort of like it's a private organization that has been contracted by the county to be a polling place. You really don't see as much, at least here in Nevada, of like, remember back in the day, you heard stories about like people having like polling places in their garage and stuff. Like that used to be a common practice, like not so much anymore. But again, just flagging that a lot of the nuance here, again, it's nuanced. All right, there we are. So there's also, I think, some key parts of the electioneering statutes that I want to make sure that we're clear on too, because this has also come up. Again, folks that are well intentioned, well, if I hear or see somebody that's electioneering or there's a problem, like I'm gonna prevent them from, maybe one of the requirements, right? You can't display badge, button, or other insignia that for or against the candidate. So if somebody shows up and they're wearing their favorite candidate shirt and they're in line at the polls, right? Like the goal isn't to like tackle them and say you're never voting again, like out you go, and then like solved it. Like that's obviously not acceptable. If saying, hey, you're violating the electioneering requirements of the statutes, you're within 100 feet, you can't be wearing that. Usually, and this is the vast majority of the time, simply pointing it out, asking them to take the button, pin, whatever, hat, put it back in their car, then get back in line, usually resolves it. In times when people have become particularly crotchety, I think is the word I'll use, we have had polling places say, got it. You want to stay in line, you want to wear your shirt, this is what we're going to do. Everybody else, you're going to come to the front, we're going to pause, nobody else will be in the polling place, you're going to vote so that you can get out of here. We're going to expedite your voting experience, so to speak, so that you can kind of get to the front of the line and move on your way without disrupting others. Because again, right, you can see it in the top here, not intended to block somebody from voting. And that's an important distinction to make. There have been other cases, where people in other states, I haven't seen this here, though I wouldn't be surprised if it happened, where they're told, hey, you can't wear that shirt. And then the individual goes, got it, and like takes off the shirt. And it's like, well, I'm going to just vote topless then, I guess. And again, like, however the clerk at the location addresses it, there's a number of different ways. But again, bottom line is it should not be prohibitive when it comes to their voting rights. Again, a little bit of clarification in the rights of the owner, again, making sure that none of these electioneering laws prohibit or otherwise interfere with the individual rights of an owner of a location too, which is important. So voter intimidation, and again, the electioneering one is the one we get the calls of the most, right? Because if somebody's at the polls and they see anything, they'll oftentimes call or relay that to local law enforcement. Voter intimidation, kind of a close second, unfortunately, of folks who report things. You can see here, this is all right out of the statute in 293-710. Threatening, use of force, coercion, violence, restraint. It's not just the use of it, but also threatening when it comes to voters. There's a lot of information in this statute that, again, depending on how you read it, there are things that may be intimidating to you, but not to me, or vice versa. So oftentimes this gets resolved by one, again, depending on the time of day. If it's during early voting, there's certain opportunities, other polling places, more opportunities. But if it's on election day, right, like that raises the concern, because it's now a matter of like, how do we support this voter's ability to vote, and trying to address it. These sorts of situations are usually resolved also very quickly, usually by somebody of an authority figure, oftentimes from the clerk or registrar's office or at the polling place. If someone's saying, I'm feeling intimidated, and it's this person, they'll kind of, adjudicate it right there on the spot. Look, we want her to vote or him to vote. We want you to not intimidate people. Can you vote and then move on your way? Those sorts of things to try to resolve it quickly. If we hear about it, oftentimes it's either after the fact or in a situation that maybe is either bubbled up to something bigger than just a quick resolution as possible. Or it may be that an individual was intimidated so much that they have not voted, and then they bring it to our attention. But again, there's also a federal statute that relates to intimidation of voters in a very serious offense, but also, right, like happens oftentimes in a minute, and not the sort of thing, certainly, as we said, that the office can necessarily get involved in. Usually the first responder or the election official on the spot usually is the one that addresses those. There's also, again, a lot of confusion, I think, and again, I think it goes back to, like I mentioned, right? There's this, depending on the individual, right? It can mean different things if you're intimidated or not. And we've seen people that were being accused of voter intimidation. Kind of a big individual just happened to be kind of next to the doorway and was watching the crowd, and folks thought that he was like trying to block the doorway. completely oblivious, waiting for somebody, sort of thing. So again, it's not always nefarious, but oftentimes, depending on what the individual is reporting, these are the sorts of things that we look, pretty closely at and try to make sure that we get our hands on. If there's a federal overlap, again, through the EITF, Erin and her team will notify our federal counterparts. But again, it's kind of a wide spectrum of what could be voter intimidation, and how we address it. Election observers, this is another one that we get a lot of calls about. So there are statutory abilities that you can kind of rest on to be an observer. Like I mentioned, anybody can be an observer, and it's a great thing. Transparency, again, across the state, county, and city election officials. I'll tell you, we are fans of transparency, big believers that the more you all and the public and every voter in our state knows and understands and sees in the process, the better off we all are, right? If you only look at voting, once every other year, maybe you're just a general election voter and not a primary voter. You never actually go in person, or maybe you vote by mail, but then you want to go observe in person. Odds are you're not going to know what you're looking at, right? And that's confusing. And then it becomes like, well, what are all these people doing? Like, it's super bizarre trying to figure out the rules of a game when you don't have a clue what kind of is governing their motions. So election observers, very important part of the process, right? We want people to see, we want people to watch and understand. This is something that I know internally, again, at the state, county, and city level, we take very seriously, that we're trying constantly to figure out how can we explain stuff so that, what sort of guidebook can you give? Or, if you like, almost like it's a museum where you walk along and you're watching and there's like a sign pointing, this is a tabulator. This is the thing that, so that they can look and understand, oh, that's why they're, the trucks come there and then they get processed here. And, understanding kind of how really the inner workings of democracy is what we're talking about. But explaining that is a challenge that we have. And I'll tell you, we don't always get it right, which is why people routinely will call and say, hey, I'm trying to be an election observer and I can't observe. I'm being denied the ability to see, what I need to see to understand and ensure the integrity of the electoral process. There is an acknowledgement form that they have to sign that prohibits and clarifies to the individuals, they can't talk to voters, right, as you're in there. Like if you're an observer, you're an observer, not a participant. You can't be advocating, for and against a candidate. There's no electioneering. You're not allowed to sneak in an electioneering. No loophole there as an observer. And you really, again, what you see on that form, if you looked at it before I had to sign it yourself, is that it's clarifying that you're not a participant. Like voters are coming in, they're going to vote. There's going to be things that happen, but like you ain't part of it. Like you're watching it. And that can be confusing and distressful for some individuals who feel that they should be able to do more. This is a challenge also because it's, to be perfectly frank, not uniform across our 17 counties. We have locations that are massive that allow dozens and dozens of observers, no problems, of every political party and affiliation. And then you have high school students, you have international observers, everybody gets to come observe, no problems. We have other places that are tiny, that physically can't fit more than 2 observers. If you only have 2 observers, who are they? Oh, wrong answer. You just thought it. It's the wrong answer, right? That's honestly how it's going to be. The major parties are going to say they should have a spot. Minor parties are going to say they should get a spot. High school students are going to want a spot. Everybody's going to want a spot. Every clerk and registrar is going to address this differently. Is it first come, first serve? Is there a sign-up sheet? Is it limited to blocks of 4 hours per observation or 8 hours? What does that look like? And because it's different across the state, as every county tries to address it to the best of their ability, given their unique local circumstances, guaranteed that somebody always thinks it's terrible. Bottom line, though, is again, the observer process. And if you do get allegations about somebody being prevented from being an observer, which again is a critical part of the process, step 1 is always asking for the clerk or registrar's observation plan. They're required to submit to the Secretary of State a plan for observation, how they're going to support it. We look very closely at those plans to make sure that, and actually are working with the counties to develop more robust plans to make it even easier so that somebody, if they want to be an observer in one county or another, can get the plan, look at it, understand what will be allowed and where and how and why, and then be able to execute that to their heart's content. Without it being kind of, a surprise when you show up and they go, oh, and I'm sorry, we only had 2 seats today. It was first come, first serve. And, the two high school students signed up for, so they're the only ones that get to observe today, those sorts of things. So again, nuanced, important, but also there's a lot of confusion about it. There's also a term that you'll see in regulation that talks about meaningful observation. This is also, again, of critical importance. What does it mean to meaningfully observe something? All of us think something different, frankly. Again, we tie it back to that it's not intended to be participation. We clarify that you're not allowed under meaningful observation to view the personal information of a voter, the ballot or ballot selections. Of course, we don't want you to see who somebody's voting for, or to listen to certain conversations, between an election board officer, between a voter and an election board officer. Election board officer, by the way, is the formal term for a poll worker. And some folks get concerned about that. Why is that voter angry? Why is the poll worker trying to reassure them? I need to hear what they're saying so I can observe meaningfully, is a claim that we get pretty regularly. But again, that's very much not the intent. We've had folks say that they felt meaningful observation could only be conducted within 2 feet of every screen in a clerk or registrar's office. Like every computer screen, they wanted to be able to be within 2 feet of all of them. Or else they were somehow unable to do this. Again, when you think about just the straight work of elections administration, having a crowd of people 2 feet from your screen might not be able to preserve the private information of the voter, or simply be able to get your job done. So it's a balance, but again, one that we continue to reassess and look for ways to improve, again, across the state, county, and cities, because of the importance of it. Ballot selfies. This one comes up, and again, you'll hear complaints about this. It's against our state law to take a picture of your ballot. When some folks, most often, again, it probably won't surprise you too much that when we get allegations of ballot selfies, it's usually accompanied by a picture of someone's social media, as they proudly vote for somebody and then post it, on X or whatever, or Facebook or something. Our policy and what we've done in the past is simply to notify the individual they're not legal. You have to take it down. So again, we're not necessarily arresting folks on the spot over that, obviously. But it is something that again, there's a reason behind it. And I think it helps to just be aware of the history. Right, the secrecy of the ballot, again, wasn't always as stringent and tight as it is now. Once upon a time, you would vote, and if you didn't vote for a certain person, right, you would get, potentially abused by your employer or by other individuals in your community. If you didn't vote for somebody, and there were ways that they could kind of check, frankly. So that this protects, again, not only the integrity of the process, but also voters, right? If it gets to the point where everybody knows who everybody else voted for, right? There's obviously intimidation factors that can come to play, and discrimination and otherwise. So ultimately, by not posting ballot selfies, we're basically collectively looking out for each other, so that, again, to reduce the threat or risk of those sorts of things happening. Again, if you get complaints, fairly straightforward though when it comes to how to address it. Bribery of an elector, this one comes up too, oftentimes misunderstood. The statute specifically says to influence any elector into giving his vote to, or to deter the elector from giving it, right? So we're talking about the bribe is specifically, vote for someone or a ballot question, or against someone or a ballot question. This comes up very frequently when we hear about get out the vote campaigns, right? Kind of either a souls to the polls, or there's going to be food at a polling place, pizza for voters sort of thing. Those are not, again, strictly, or at least, again, depending on the nuance of the scenario that I just described, aren't bribery of an elector. Oftentimes we tell folks, like, it ain't a good look if you're, trying to do certain things. But if it doesn't violate the statute itself, we just basically encourage folks to be very careful about that. And the best practice that we found, and what a number of different groups are doing, is that it's not just, you get pizza if you're a voter and I have to see the I voted sticker, but your whole family can get pizza, right? Like you came here, you're getting free food, as long, and then folks are voting too. So if someone shows up and doesn't vote, like, they should still be able to get a piece of pizza. That basically nips it in the bud and reduces the odds of a successful accusation of bribery of an elector, but again, also something that we look very closely at. Unlawful interference. This is one also. Right? We talk about electioneering and the sign requirements. And again, if you hadn't looked, and again, I really hope that you do now, if you weren't looking for signs before, this is one that is also really nuanced. It might almost just sound like somebody's being weird, for lack of a better term, right? A person shall not remain in or outside of a polling place so as to interfere with the conduct of the election. We've had people hang out in polling places after they've closed and like try to hide under a desk and to like then jump out after everyone's left and like, I don't know, do something, distract, like to the point where, again, it's distracting from the staff. It's alarming to people when you see like a grown adult like huddled under a table, right? Like that's weird to see at a polling place. So like it causes an interruption and it ultimately is something that results in a call. Removing a ballot from any polling place before the close of polls, right? Folks that, and this thankfully doesn't happen nearly as much, but may more this next year. And I'll talk about some of the changes here in a minute about what's different from the 26 election cycle from the 24 election cycle. But what we now use across our state, ballot marking devices. BMD is the system is called. What does that mean? When you vote, if you're here in Clark County, actually in any of our counties now, if you vote in person, you make your selections on a screen. It will print out your ballot, it then gets put into either the ballot drop box or the tabulator. If you try to take that and leave deliberately or take somebody else's, that's their ballot now. And if you're trying to sneak out with that, like that's a problem. Used to be, and right, you maybe would have just thought like what's the statute for not being a weirdo? Like turns out that's elections interference. And there's a specific statute here, 293-730, that addresses those sorts of possibilities and allegations. So again, devil's in the details, but looking through those, sub D there, applying to receive a ballot in an election precinct other than the one where the person's entitled to vote. Clearly a little bit archaic because that speaks to a time when we have precinct specific voting, asking people certain information, those sorts of things. So again, 293-730 is very much a nuanced election statute that comes up sometimes. I see that we are joined by Secretary Aguilar this morning. So I appreciate, Mr. Secretary, that you let me finish the slide, but I'll turn it over to you for some comments.
Thank you, Mark. Well, good morning, everybody. I apologize for this funky setup. I feel like we're lecturing rather than engaging with you. And I know a lot of time legislative hearings are about talking to you rather than talking with you. So I apologize for the format. But good morning. Good to see everybody. Thank you for being here. As we know, we have another election coming up in Nevada in 26. It's an interesting one because of the fact we don't have a statewide federal race, which will make the dynamics a little bit different. Every constitutional officer is on the ballot, which makes it more of a local state race. However, 26 is a setup for 28. And we know that Nevada is going to be at the forefront of the 28 election. And because of that, it makes 26 a much more contentious local race than I think we've had it before. You may not know, in 28 will be the first time in a long time where we've had an open primary for president in both political parties. So, and Nevada right now is competing to be first in the nation for the Democratic presidential nomination, which will draw a lot of attention to Nevada, even though we are already at the forefront because we do determine who the president of the United States is. And that's a big role and that's a big responsibility. So our elections become even more nuanced and more of a focal point for the rest of the country. And the Secretary of State's office, the 17 clerks across the state, have to be on top of their game. And they're dependent on you. We really, really need your cooperation. We need your help to make sure that Nevada continues to be the place where we have some of the safest, most secure, and accessible elections in the country. However, with that becomes the importance of transparency. We need to continue to get our voters to understand what the process is, how the process works, but also hold people accountable when they try to be a bad actor. We also know Nevada is a target for foreign actors, and we need to make sure our systems are just as secure as they are ever. We've been working really hard at the Secretary of State's office the last 3 years to really invest in our cybersecurity, but also to the security of the system. We did have a working relationship with CISA, but that's changed a bit. And so I met with the governor to talk to him about Nevada taking responsibility for its own elections and really being strategic about how we're going to protect our elections. And again, if there's anything we can do, I can do to help make your job easier, what do you need? Please tell us. Obviously, Mark is a good partner. The Attorney General's office is a good partner with us and all of you. So grateful for the opportunity. Happy to answer any questions if you have any questions, but I think there's more important things for you to talk about rather than listen to me. So, but again, just thank you for being here. All right. Did I forget anything, Mark?
Sure.
Okay. Aaron? Murphy?
Absolutely not.
All right. Perfect. All right. Thank you.
We've been, to the Secretary's point, we've been talking at you for a minute. We're going to go ahead and take a quick 5-minute break while the Secretary's here. That way, if you do want to introduce yourselves to him, you're able to do so, or if you need to hit the facilities. But if you don't mind, look at your watch, add 5 minutes to the time, and then we'll be back seated at that time. Thank you. All right, we can go ahead and resume. I want to start. Any questions, thoughts, concerns, observations, even up front? Just that effective that I answered everything preemptively. That's cool. All right, excellent. In that case, then we'll continue with the slides and kind of keep working our way through. Again, a handful more covering some of the common election crimes, just as a refresher, and then we'll talk about kind of the future and the way ahead.
Don't lie to them. It's not a handful.
It's a handful.
We got a lot of.
It's a hand. My hand is full. All right. So we're on slide 30, I believe, talking about unlawful interference, right? 293-730. Perfect. And let's see here. Okay, so 293-730 continues. Again, this part, subsection 2, actually talks about, you can almost picture it from like a basketball standpoint, right? Persons should not willfully impede or interfere with the return of a voter's mail ballot, right? So if you see somebody kind of, trying to like block somebody from a ballot drop box, that hasn't happened, thankfully, but we kind of envision this likely coming up probably towards the end of the day or at the close of polls, right? If somebody's like, oh yeah, there's a ballot drop box, I got to drop my mail ballot in there, and so I was like, nope, it's too late. I think it's too late because my non-GPS synchronized watch tells me it's 7 p.m., but really it's 6:50 or something. But again, bottom line, the sort of incident that happens probably very quickly, but again, still warrants looking into to make sure that we understand and protect voters' rights as best as possible. I will say that there's a proactive measure that's been taken across the state too, where ballot drop boxes almost uniformly are staffed by 2 people, typically a bipartisan team of different political affiliations, so that there's always a person next to, at least one, if not 2, next to that ballot drop box, so that when an individual does come up to turn in their mail ballot, that poll worker would validate that they signed the back, which is often kind of a common mistake that people forget to do, and then also can say, yes, it's still open, or sorry, the polls have closed, we're locking it now, it's too late, it's now 10 after, or something along those lines. Okay, ballot collecting. This is one also that I think we get a lot of calls about because there's, again, a number of different requirements across the state. You can see on the slide that, across the 35 states that allow somebody other than a voter to, return a voted ballot, we're one of those. You hear the term, ballot collecting, but also ballot harvesting or voter assistance, right? All kind of different terms for the same concept. The idea that you as a voter have received the mail ballot, you have filled it out, you have signed the back and met all the other requirements, and now, gosh darn it, you want to drop it off, but there's some sort of obstacle between you and the polls, right? Maybe you're busy, maybe you're on your way out of town. Something prevents you, the voter, from returning it to the county election officials required by law. You may also, again, here in Nevada, you're able to mail it back, and we're going to talk about the mail process and what that might do here in the near future also. But if somebody doesn't want to mail, they don't have to mail it back, is the key. And they can give it to a person to return. The statute is really interesting because it talks about it's just a person, so it's whomever you designate. Other states, in some cases, there's a couple that limit it to a family member, household member, or like even in some cases, it's got to be another voter. I think in at least a couple states, ours do not say that. Ours is really whomever you designate as an individual can turn in that mail ballot. When people have contacted the office expressing concerns about ballot collection or ballot harvesting, we tell them, look, the easiest way is to just return it yourself. If you're concerned about your ballot being turned in, you can always just bring it to the polls. Again, we have the locations of ballot drop boxes are on the websites, on the county and state ones, so that we can provide that information. There's a number of different ways that you can see where the ballot drop boxes are and the hours that they're available. But bottom line, again, when in doubt, just return it yourself. We do also, though, we keep a close eye on individuals that report that they provided their mail ballot to an individual, and then they did not get vote credit or vote history. This actually doesn't happen nearly as much as you think. I think maybe once in at least since 2020 that I'm aware of, where an individual passed off their ballot to somebody. But what we're looking for, though, for your awareness, in case it comes up, and part of the reason why I want to stress this one is one that it's worthy of reporting to the Office of Secretary of State, is that if we do, hear a number of individuals that say, I saw an individual looked like a nice person, his van had free candy spray painted on the outside, seemed legit. I gave them my ballot, as did my neighbors, and none of us got vote history. That's the sort of thing that we're flagging, right? That we're looking out for. Individuals who are attempting to gather ballots, presumably to turn them into the county election officials, but then ultimately discard them or destroy them. That's the concern. But again, that really has not yet happened, thankfully, but we keep an eye out for it. The other element, and really one of the concerns, and again, I stress the fact that this is different across the country, so that every state has got a little bit of a different nuance to it. But when you look at, and you'll see it here on this next slide, that we do have requirements that are important to be aware of when it comes to ballot collecting, that are specific to the timing, right? The key question then is, how long have you had the ballots? Because if you provide to somebody else your voted ballot and ask them to turn it in, basically the clock starts. They've got from the time you hand it to them to the third day of receipt to turn it in. If it's less than 3 days to election day, they have until the close of polls on election day to turn it in. If not, then it's a problem. This is something also that we found through doing a lot of outreach and education is really easiest mitigated through just explaining that timeline to voters. We've had a number of well-intentioned organizations that said, well, we're going to allow our members to drop off their ballots here in an unofficial drop box at our office or location. And on a weekly basis, they said, we're going to turn them into the clerk or registrar. It'll be nice and it'll be consistent, and we'll do it within a week. We've pointed the statute and said, you can't actually. You need to make sure that it's at least every 3 days to comply with the statutes to make sure those ballots are getting turned in. So again, not a concern. I will also say that if you hear stories, or if somebody says that there was a movie that came out a little bit ago that alleged ballot harvesting and was a problem, I'll be honest, I watched it when it came out, so I was informed about what it talked about. Easily and quickly refuted it based on the existence of state laws and the kind of realities on the deck here in Nevada. But the bottom line is that if somebody reports to you that there was an individual that turned in 20 ballots into a drop box, yeah, that's fine, like totally legal. What happens to those ballots? They still go through the same process every other ballot does, right? There's security measures. There's a barcode on the back of the envelope. That barcode gets scanned. It's associated with an individual. If that individual's already voted once in person, then that mail ballot becomes Exhibit 1 in the criminal referral. If the person turns in 20 ballots and all of them are scanned and all of them are associated with 20 voters who haven't voted, the next step is a signature verification. The clerk registrar and their team will review the signature. If it doesn't match what's in the voter's record, then it goes to the signature cure. So the ability for someone to snatch up one of your ballots, kind of scrawl a name on there and assume it's going to get past the system, like it simply it isn't the reality. But again, going back to the idea of ballot collecting, by itself, not an issue. If it turns out that an individual dropped off 20 ballots and they were actually photocopied envelopes and the barcodes on the back were all the same, yeah, then absolutely is something we would look into is a number of possible statutory violations. But the collection and delivering of ballots themselves to an election official, inherently not a crime under Nevada law. This is an interesting one also, I think very similar to 730, right? The idea of somebody being weird in the polls and not realizing that maybe it touches on elections, an election crime also. 293, 730, and 750, and then you'll see in 755 also, if somebody tries to break into a polling place, breaking and entering by itself, obviously a problem. But when it comes time during an election, if it's a polling place, if they're trying to remove or destroy, it's not just the voting machines, but the equipment or other items in that polling place. Again, there's a specific statute that talks about that, including the defacement of cards or instructions, gross misdemeanor. But again, and this is just a probably say this about 15 times already, but during an election year, there are things that otherwise would be addressed in one way that now become an election crime. And that sort of breaking and entering or tampering with information inside the polls absolutely is something that is unacceptable. The next one, 293-755, that you'll see on the slide. This one, again, also interesting, very similar in that sort of, if somebody comes into a polling place and is mad or upset about something, and does a thing where they attempt to destroy, or we've had individuals, even here in Clark County, try to grab the check-in kiosk, the poll pad looking iPad thing, try to grab it and shake it or throw it, or it's not just somebody being belligerent, again, weirdo, but also now they're tampering with equipment. This statute 755 talks specifically about two types of tampering that are felonies. The first one, to prevent proper operation, right? If you take a poll pad, a check-in kiosk, and fling it against a wall, arguably you're trying to prevent its proper operation. That's one thing, as opposed to an attempt to influence the outcome of the election, right? Different if you find a group of individuals huddled around a voting machine, trying to tamper with it and alter it or try to reprogram it. That's a very distinct and separate crime that falls under a different provision of the same statute. Again, also extremely important that we hear about those sorts of breaking and entering type of issues or tampering or messing with. But that is, in our minds, kind of what we're first looking for. They're just trying to break stuff because they just don't like elections or the process or something, or is it really more of an attempt to alter, who is going to win an election? I think it's also important, and this is kind of a thing that I've met people that have only voted by mail over their lives. Couldn't point at a voting machine if it jumped in front of them, so to speak. If you haven't seen the voting systems used across our state, I certainly encourage you to reach out to the clerk or registrar and ask for kind of a demo. I know Registrar Portillo and her team here in Clark County exceptionally helpful when it comes to informing, and providing training and demonstrations, those sorts of things. If the question is simply, I want to make sure that my team understands what falls under 293-755, like what things could be messed with, and like what are they to look like? So if I see somebody doing something, I know this is not just a crime, but like an election-specific crime. The check-in kiosks that I mentioned, the poll pads are on the left side of the screen now. Again, it looks like it doesn't look like an iPad. It is an iPad-looking thing with some proprietary software that enables, again, a voter when they check in. All that does is that it's synchronized to the state database, so that when a voter anywhere in our state checks into the polls, almost immediately they are given vote credit, so that person has checked into the polls and voted. The idea is that if they check in, walk up to a voting machine, cast their ballot, and then leave, and then sprint down the street to the nearest polling place, by the time they get there, it will already reflect that they have already voted. Again, they will be told, it looks like you voted down the street maybe like 10 minutes ago, kind of given that sort of warning heads up. But if an individual insists on casting, in that case, would be a provisional ballot. Again, that's a violation of statute and also would be Exhibit 1 in their criminal referral. The other part of the slide, the right side, I do want to point out that it's a little bit harder to see. But again, those of you that have voted in person in Clark County before, I'm here to tell you it's going to be different in 2026. The machines, if you look, it's kind of hard to see. It looks like kind of a larger screen is the ICX. That's the screen where you actually touch your selections when you're casting a ballot. Immediately to the right of those, you'll see in the picture, though, in that kind of lighter blue booth, is a thing that we used to refer to as a voter verifiable paper audit trail, a VVPAT. It's a thing. That's the thing that when it would record your vote, so that after you use the machine, you would look to the right, validate that it was tabulated or correctly recorded, and then your vote was cast both in the machine and then also on that paper trail. Those are no longer used in Nevada. 24 was the last election cycle that we're going to be using those, and the clerks made the decisions across the state to transition from those to a ballot marking device. The ballot marking devices on the left side of the screen were already in use in Lander and Carson City. But in the other 15 counties that were using previously, it was Dominion. Dominion has now been purchased and renamed as Liberty Vote. But the Liberty Vote machines are now going to look like you see on the right. But arguably all three of those pieces of machinery are the voting machines that we're talking about here. The ICX is the big screen, the vertical screen. That's again where you actually make your selections. What will happen now in these 15 counties is that it will, when you're done and you hit, accept, it prints out on that printer to the right. That is just a normal, commercial off-the-shelf printer. It will actually print out your ballot for you. You'll then pick up that ballot, look at it to validate that the selections that you made are the ones that were recorded. And then again, the ballot that you're holding in your hand, you'll then walk over to either a ballot drop box or a tabulator that is the black box looking thing on the bottom right, center right of the slide. And you will be able to put your ballot directly into the tabulator yourself. That will then, tabulate and record your vote as well. So a slightly different experience, but again, one where the key components are important to be aware of. Again, if it comes to destruction or if you see something where maybe someone's stealing these sorts of machines, again, important to be at the very least aware of what they look like. So voting more than once, again, mentioned it a minute ago. This one I've kind of buried a little bit further down because again, I don't want you to think for a second that people, large numbers of people are successfully voting more than once. The systems that we have in place, the security systems overall, do prevent that. So the statute 23780 does clarify that it's against the law to vote or attempt to vote in the same election more than once. So those attempt to votes are really what we see the most. An individual will vote in person and then go home and look at the mail ballot sitting on their kitchen table. They'll start to think, man, I could get away with this. I might vote twice. No one's going to know ever, right? We know. We do know. And in fact, when they mail that ballot in, right, it gets blocked immediately, right? I told you about the process earlier, scans the barcode on the back associated with the voter, immediately rejected. So that the first vote does count. They get to exercise that constitutional right. And the second one does not. And again, that ends up coming across my desk and then Aaron's on its way to a criminal referral. So that comes up. And I want to mention that again, because you'll hear calls and complaints about individuals voting or attempting to vote twice. We now have the systems because of the VREMS project, the Voter Registration Election Management Solution project the state's been working on. And our project team has been really working incredibly hard on for the last couple of years, hand in hand with the county and city election officials. We have the ability to not only track in near real time individuals that vote or attempt to vote twice, but now we have at the state level the same information that the county election officials used to. Used to be that if we heard an allegation, we'd have to contact the clerk. You can imagine during an election, certainly during early voting or leading up to election day, they're focused on helping support voters vote. Now we're at a point where we contact them to make sure that they're aware of it, but we have access to all the same information. The voters' registrations, the ballot information about when the ballot was sent, when it was received, the image of the ballot from when they turned it in, if it was scanned, we have that as well, which also greatly expedites our ability to review and make criminal referrals for individuals who have attempted to vote twice. There's also a federal statute under 52 USC. This is 1037. It's covered in the federal side of it also. So again, routinely, depending on the nature of the allegations, like if it makes sense that if we're able to adjudicate or if it comes down from the federal side, but again, it's really across the board, not something that anybody involved in elections administration is comfortable with because, again, we take the integrity of the electoral process so seriously. Betting on an election. This is one that I want to stress too, because it's kind of, honestly, it hadn't come up until just like last election cycle, interestingly enough. This one I saw there was an update on even just a couple days ago that I copied and pasted and threw on here. In part because of these prediction markets. Nobody nod too aggressively because I don't want to know if you use them or not. It's on you if you do, and that's fine. I'm not going to say anything about that. But prediction markets, right, where you can bet on anything like the news cycle to the weather to whatever else you feel like you want to bet on. There's some ongoing litigation from our state against Kalshi kind of calling into question whether or not they're licensed as a sports bettor and those sorts of things. You can see the update that I put on here. Just again, this is January 14th. I won't read it to you, but the bottom line is that our lawsuit's one of several that Kalshi in particular is facing. And I know regulators across the country are trying to figure out how to get their hands around that and like, what does it mean? But every once in a while, we hear somebody, oftentimes it's, a family member says, so-and-so's, I think he's betting on stuff that he shouldn't be. And we'll look into it, but still fairly rare. Yes.
Hi, Craig Newby, First Assistant Attorney General. Prediction markets is part of my portfolio at the moment. Just so everyone's up to date as of today's recording, the state has filed a civil enforcement action against Polymarket, which is another one of these prediction markets. It would be the Gaming Control Board's position based on the status of the various court cases, which I'm not going to recite to anyone here. There is nothing that prohibits the Gaming Control Board or the Gaming Commission from seeking to enforce Nevada's gaming laws against prediction markets outside of a temporary agreement, which will be resolved yea or nay. There's a Ninth Circuit appeal for one of these cases where that court's working through whether a stay should be granted. But as of right now, except for one entity, there's nothing that stops state regulatory enforcement of prediction markets. So that's the status on the ground right now. How that fits into potential criminal prosecutions and mens rea of those who may be violating the statute that Mark was referencing, I leave that for other people to sort out. But just so everyone understands where the state's position is on prediction markets right now, that's what's going on.
Thank you. I really appreciate the update. Very timely and good to know. Certain there'll probably be more updates as we get closer to June and November too, which will exciting. The next statute I want to talk a little bit about after the betting on an election one. This was a statute that was introduced in a bill back in 2023, Senate Bill 406, the 23 regular session. It has since been codified in NRS 293-705 as unlawful acts concerning election officials. This one, interestingly enough, comes up more out of concern leading up to the election so far than during the election. And to be frank, this isn't actually a concern. Let me back up. As an election official and having been in the position since 2020, right, it's a very real fact that election officials across our country, and I want to provide, the quick minute of testimony on like the fact that people have been threatened and lives ruined because of someone's job as an election official across our country, including within our state. We've had individuals who have left their positions and whose families had to move. Again, it's been extremely tragic. This statute was approved unanimously and signed by the governor to protect election officials. Since its passage and since the very clear message from our legislature and the governor that it's unacceptable to threaten people for simply administering an election, that ultimately we are simply doing our jobs, and that, again, you can be upset about the results of the election, you can have questions on the integrity, you can ask questions about how the machines work and what the security features are, but there's a line that will not be tolerated when it comes to threats relating to the intimidation or coercion and other kind of elements as it relates to election officials. That has been tremendously reassuring. And again, I know while there's still concerns about those sorts of issues coming up, that uniform message has been very helpful in I think increasing retention across our state, again, recognizing the message it sent. By the way, also, we're like unicorns in the country. There were other states that looked at similar statutes, ultimately decided not to pass anything at all. There were others where they made it, a gross misdemeanor, but ours is a category E felony. So it's got some teeth to it. The statute itself, and I won't go into the specifics too deeply other than to say that again, there's a threat or use of threat of force intimidation and the other elements there up in subsection 1 that are prohibited. This does also say that it can't be done. You're not allowed to do these things, not only in a polling place, but also at other locations. So, if somebody's wearing an election shirt out after finishing their shift as a poll worker and they get harassed at a grocery store or something, again, that's equally problematic. It's also the sort of thing that is not limited to permanent employees. So it's not just the clerk or registrar themselves, but also their permanent staff at the county, city, or in the elections division of the state. It also applies to poll workers. So if you're a poll worker, if you in the crowd are a poll worker working at home, and you are leaving the polls and somebody accosts you or tries to threaten you because you were simply doing your job as a poll worker, right? Passing out I voted stickers, helping guide people to machines, tabulating, being on a duplication board, whatever your role ends up being, like that again is a felony if they were doing that to you. The statute also talks about doxing individuals. So there's a clear, effort to protect the online, and just otherwise not having those individuals' information put out there either. But again, as I mentioned, when we get calls about this, oftentimes it's about observers who are concerned that they are going to be targeted for harassing an election official simply because they are concerned or have questions about the process or ask a lot of questions about security, those sorts of things. The statute, I think, to its benefit and credit, also protects the rights of observers. It also clarifies very specifically that an observer is still able to do all of these things, right? Observe the conduct of tests, pursuant to 293B 145, or the counting of ballots at the central counting place, or the handling of ballots. And all these things are still absolutely allowed to happen. It's just that you can't try to prevent somebody from doing their job as an election official while you're doing that. It also calls out, and again, this is an interesting one because it apparently is illegal in other states, which confuses me pretty heavily. You can still pass out prepackaged food items, non-alcoholic beverages, coats, hand warmers, and other similar items. I guess that's illegal in some states. But not here. So if you get calls or reports about somebody, committing the dastardly act of passing out, water bottles at the polls, not a problem. We have had to clarify in the past that if the water bottles have, a campaign slogan on them, and now it's electioneering, so there's kind of an overlap there. You got to ask the questions. But water bottles, snacks, food, or again, even I'm told down here in Clark County, even in November, like it might get a little chilly, right? Maybe below 60 almost. And if you need to warm people up, you guys deal with that, but understandable and it's acceptable, right? To pass out coats and jackets and those sorts of things. Okay. This is the wrap-up slide for the statutes, and then we're going to break free from talking about statutory requirements and get into some other things. So kind of a quick stream here. Voting by a person who knows he or she is not eligible. This one comes up occasionally if we see an individual, not just if there's a non-citizen who registers or attempts to vote. If those individuals did and it wasn't caught any part of the process, that would be a violation of 293-775. Also, again, we've seen individuals who are incarcerated felons, who have tried to cast a ballot, also knowing that as a felon and having been told by the courts that they've had their civil rights revoked while they're an incarcerated felon. Of course, the day they get out after that felony conviction has been served, they regain automatically their civil rights. But if they're incarcerated as a felon, again, they don't. If they vote, that's also problematic, obviously, and investigated. Voting in the name of another person, right? This is the statute that covers individuals who attempt to vote for a deceased family member. Again, no surprise, but well, maybe it is. We take, like I said, and I will continue to hound that we take election integrity very seriously. We look closely at the master death file that the Social Security Administration puts out, and we compare that to our voter rolls. Not only do we do that on a daily basis, but as we get closer to an election, it turns out, and again, I remember this is back in 22, I think, that we did the analysis. There were about 50 people a day in certain counties that would pass during an election cycle, leading up, really from the day mail ballots get sent out prior to the 46th day for military and overseas voters, all the way up until the 20th day for in-state voters. We track individuals who are on the master death file and have passed away, and against our voter rolls to see if a mail ballot was sent or the polls open for early voting, the individual votes, and then they pass, die a day or two later. That happens a lot more than people realize. And as long as the order is in that order, like ballots went out, got to the voter, they vote, and then die, no problems. When the order ain't that way, that's when we ask questions and we investigate that, right? If the ballots are sent out 2 or 3 days later, if the person passes away before ballots are sent out and they still somehow manage to get that vote off, again, uncomfortable conversations with in many cases, grieving loved ones. But voting in the name of another, again, is simply against the law and not acceptable in any situation. Voter registration fraud, NRS 293-800. If you have individuals that are, registering improperly, again, less of a case nowadays than before, but also something that we take and receive complaints about and investigate fully. There's also kind of a close tie to that where you're not supposed to be paid to register the number of people to vote if you're in a voter registration drive. We watch that. Campaign finance shenanigans. I did you all a pretty good solid here by not talking about any of the campaign finance shenanigans that can come up. It could literally take hours. It gets super nuanced, painful, complex. But also, right, we have statutes that identify how much individuals can receive in contributions and how much, like what they can spend it on. And when we get allegations of that, it's typically not quick to investigate, but absolutely gets investigated. I wanted to highlight also, and this is one of the changes from the 24 election cycle that you may not be aware of, during the 2025 special session that occurred just a few months ago, Assembly Bill 3 was passed that added a new campaign finance category, and it clarified in statute, and was signed by the governor ultimately, that candidates are able to spend campaign donations on personal security. The intent, based on the discussions that were held around that bill, were so that candidates, again, that were interested in running for office, or individuals that were interested in being candidates, didn't have to worry that they couldn't spend their contributions to protect themselves and their families, given today's heightened political violence and the possibility of that at any rate. A recent regulation that actually, it's Friday, tomorrow. It may be adopted, I'll say, so don't spoil alert for tomorrow morning, but it may be adopted where we accept or create a regulation that ultimately goes to the Legislative Commission that clarifies what does it mean for personal security. If you're going to spend money that are campaign contributions as a candidate on personal security, what does that mean? And that proposed regulation helps define that a little bit. So, some people have said, well, it's just guns. It's just, security guards. There's kind of a wide range of topics, frankly, that encompass personal security. Everything from removing paying for one of those internet services that removes your information from the internet, like your private information or your address. It does encompass guns and ammunition, but also training and other things. So, if there's questions about campaign finance, again, those also get routed directly to the Office of Secretary of State, also something that we take very seriously. But I suspect if more candidates do decide to have bodyguards and others, there may be allegations that come our way relating to the purchase of weapons or hiring of security personnel as it relates to personal security. Political sign violations. There's also a lot of complaints that we receive about sign placement on highways, on county roads or city roads, and we have a process in place where we address those also. Those, if you hear about them, again, you probably will ultimately push those towards us, but we're going to be collaborating closely with the county and city offices that are the appropriate enforcement organizations to address those. Okay, so all that being said, those are the majority of the statutes. So are there other creative ones that individuals might try to violate? Sure, not worthy of attention today or right now, but absolutely, it is the full spectrum. Everything that's in Title 24 is something that we take very seriously, and is ultimately the Secretary's responsibility to execute and enforce. So that being said, since 2020, kind of what's going on, and we are very much now, this is the downward slope of the presentation here. For your reassurance, so since 2020, a lot's changed, right? Like more and more as we've seen. And I think when you look at the list of items on the slide and some of the reported activities that we received as an office in 2020, in 22, that bled into 24, a lot of this, in some cases, some of it has gone up a little bit in reporting, other cases it's gone down. Other cases, some of it's gone up in other states, but not in Nevada. I want to talk about, looking at certain things from, through the lens of, elections administrators across the country. It's important that we take into consideration what is happening in some of our adjacent states, recognizing that some of those things may bleed over into our state. The mail theft, again, as Aaron mentioned before, the idea that, turns out mail theft happens all the time. I didn't honestly know that, but during, again, the period of time leading up to from the 45 days before election day up through election day, if somebody breaks into one of the blue mailboxes and is looking for credit cards or whatever, oftentimes they steal ballots now, either voted or unvoted. And being mindful of those sorts of things, especially is important for the reporting, but then also so we can notify the voters and have them either spoil and then resubmit a new ballot if one has been tampered with or otherwise are aware of what happened. So these things that we saw since 2020, right? And on this next slide, you'll see like it continues. There's threats of violence, threats against election officials. There was an issue with arson in other states. And I'm on slide 44 now for you to see that. There was an issue in states that had drop boxes that were not observed, where individuals were tossing incendiary devices into those boxes and trying to just destroy all the ballots. Kind of a, again, just that's an all-encompassing kind of negative slide, isn't it? So things have been happening. So this year, like the secretary mentioned, an overview of our ballot. Important to note, like the secretary said, we don't have that U.S. Senate race on the 26 Nevada ballot. We do have our 4 representatives in Congress, of course, they'll be on the ballot. So from a federal standpoint, again, we will have federal candidates on the ballot, which makes it a federal election, both the primary and the general. Statewide, and this really just ties into what the secretary said, right? That it's very much going to be a state-specific election. We may not necessarily be in the national eye, which may help in certain senses, but the reality is that for Nevadans, it's an important election. And again, I would argue that you probably couldn't find a not important election that we have in our state, given the importance of the role of our elected officials across the state, county, and city government. Not only will be all 6 constitutional officers, but there's been a number of resignations in our assembly and other parts of our legislature that are opening up opportunities that will make things contentious. We typically expect during a midterm election year like 26 is a higher number of candidates overall than in a presidential year, in part because it's our 6 constitutional offices. And depending on how the kind of rhythm works out, there may be as many as 1,300 candidates who file for office. We're already at about 155 from judicial offices already, but we expect that number to continue to spike. Clark County, again, as I recall, has about 70 judicial races on their ballot. So again, when you think longer lines at the polls, potentially, just given the number of offices, the number of individuals that will be, having to look at, their different candidates, that also may again create other kind of friction points, right? So expecting it to be contentious, I think, is a sound approach, but likely not on a national level, right? This won't be the election where your cousins and family members from out of state will reach back and kind of ask what's going on. This is going to be more of an us Nevadans talking about our elected leaders. So the timeline. I think it's important to highlight also the timeline, right? It's not just June 9th and November 3rd that we mentioned really you need to be mindful of. The Elections Integrity Task Force, of course, will be meeting on both those election days on June 9th here in Las Vegas and also in Carson City, as well as on November 3rd. Like I mentioned, we've already started and concluded our candidate filing period for judicial offices. The next period for offices, for candidate filing will be in the first 2 weeks of March. That will also really lead to kind of a spike in the number of signs and campaign ads and otherwise, as the candidates will be campaigning to get their names out and to talk to voters. That really begins in March. When we look at the June primary, though, and you'll notice the timeline is essentially the same for both the June and November elections. That Uniformed and Overseas Citizen Absentee Voting Act deadline is April 24th. That's the 46th day before the election, September 25th for the general. That's when the first mail ballots are going to be sent out across the state. So the way it works is that under the federal Uniform and Overseas Citizen Absentee Voting Act, there are certain definitions for military and overseas voters. Our state law in 293D is far more permissive. And as a result, like when you think about military and overseas citizens, it's important to understand that those ballots aren't only for folks in our state overseas, right? It's not just deployed military members. If you're a member of the Guard who's on active duty orders, but you're still here in the state training leading up to a deployment, if you're on active duty orders, then you qualify as a uniformed overseas citizen under the Uniform Overseas Citizen Absentee Voting Act and under 293D. That matters again because ballots will be going out, like I said, that 46th day before, no later than the 46th day before the election. From that point on, again, expect to see a spike in complaints based on the information I provided earlier in this presentation, as well as through the start of early voting. Again, we have our 2 weeks of in-person early voting. You can see it starts there May 23rd through June 5th, before a brief pause before Election Day. Again, Election Day itself also, to an extent, at least for election administrators, is not the finish line. The mail ballots that are postmarked on or before Election Day still have to be received up to the 4th day after Election Day, and then there's 2 additional days for signature curing. So if there's a question on the signature, again, ballots that are received have to go through the security process. It's extremely important. That continues up to the 7th day after the election. 8th day is when we assess provisionals across the state, which are ballots that are cast where the individual may still need to provide other information, assuming they've been cured. We look at that to make sure nobody's attempted to vote in 2 different counties. And then ultimately, the clerks and registrars have to go in front of their board of supervisors or county commissioners to canvass the vote by that 10th day. That's June 19th, which also is a holiday this year. So those timelines, when you think about them, right, like you can kind of see ballots going out, a possible spike in complaints, concerns, allegations relating to folks attempting to vote twice. Individuals may attempt to vote twice, again, improperly and get caught by that 44th or so day. It can happen very quickly. The first ballots are usually returned to a clerk or registrar within 24 hours. There's a handful of individuals across our state who take pride in getting the ballot first and then turning it in almost immediately. And from that point all the way up until the 7th day after the election, again, is really when we're watching to see and make sure that the integrity of the process is solid and the individuals that are worthy of an investigation are getting it, frankly. County commission canvasses in the past have been a little bit problematic in some places too, as individuals who don't like the results of the election oftentimes verbalize that to their county leadership. Again, less so for the primary, oftentimes more so for the general, but sometimes still very contentious and worthy of being mindful of. Typically, it's the 17th, 18th, and 19th of the days that the canvasses happen, those last 3 days of the window, and that oftentimes is when those sorts of concerns come up. Following June 19th, again, it will be a break until mail ballots go out. During that time, again, additional information will be coming out, revisions and other, again, information from your county and state election officials leading up to the UOCAVA deadline, but then essentially that timeline repeats itself for our general election. As it's not a presidential election, no electoral college this year. So in this case, the Supreme Court canvass on November 24th, the 4th Tuesday of November, right before Thanksgiving, will be the canvass of our statewide and multi-county offices and really the finish line of the electoral process. Of course, before folks get sworn in first of the year, second of the year, and then we move into our February legislative session. So here's my prediction. Everything's gonna be fine. It'll be perfect. Like your county, state, city election officials working extremely hard to inform voters, prepare, make sure security measures are in place, document chain of custody, all of the things that we just talked about, they are keenly aware of and mitigating even as we speak. So I think it's going to be really good. And I think you should too. But let's just suppose for a second that maybe it ain't. There's really, I found a couple of different domains, so to speak, that oftentimes, kind of help codify and capture or categorize rather the types of issues that we see. And when you look at the Venn diagram there, there's been a continued increase in cybercrime, right? And attempts at cyber attacks. Our state was hit with easily, I think, the worst cyber attack in any state history. Those sorts of issues, right? If there's a continued attempt to conduct ransomware at the state or county level, or some other sort of cybercrime, oftentimes that could lead to questions that result in litigation. If a county, for example, their website's hacked, if information is spoiled, independent of the electoral process and not touching the voter rolls even, but there could be a perception of wrongdoing or wrong information that could lead to litigation that oftentimes will result in the public being upset and frustrated by what they perceive to be unfair treatment or concerns that weren't being addressed the way they maybe should have. That's kind of one area. The criminal activity piece, right? If folks break into a county office and destroy voting machines, that also could result in litigation. Some of our counties have less than 20 voting systems. Again, it's not a lot. They're fairly hard to replace. Destroying those could also lead to litigation, which could also lead to a result of voters not being able to cast a legal ballot, which is also would be extremely concerning. We talk about cybercrime, kind of leading to criminal activity. If there's a data leak of some sort that leads to a spike in personal identity being stolen, and then questions about, are other things influencing either my vote or somehow preventing this from being a free and fair election, also very much concerning. And the number 4, of course, right, is kind of the hodgepodge of all of the above. There's a lot of litigation that's going on right now across the country. A lot of those lawsuits that are being addressed in the Secretary's office and the Office of the Attorney General and others are addressing, are in the public eye. And they're sending a message to the public. And again, members of the public are getting concerned about that and have questions. But if there's an appearance of possible litigation that either maybe is decided by the courts in one way or another, that also could potentially lead to either cyber or criminal activity that also could interfere with the conduct of the election. All right. So when we think about all these different sort of things, this is kind of the sphere of influence that we're looking at, that we're trying to make sure that we get our hands around as a state with our partners, you included, of course, and at the county and city level, so that as these things come up, that we have strong messaging. So what's our mitigation plan? The communication one, I think, is one of the most critical, and one that we've absolutely learned from and improved over the last couple of years. It's got to be timely communication. If we hear about something that's statewide, it's extremely important that we be able to communicate with you in a way that you're going to see it and be able to do something about. Us, kind of screaming into the void or sending, messages that go to the wrong person because they left the office, or, we're originally assigned to the Elections Integrity Task Force in January, but then they shifted over to something else and it was gapped in February. It doesn't help anybody. So communication is extremely important, and making sure that the information that we're sending to you, now this is kind of on us, is applicable to you. If it's not applicable information, then there's certain kind of slices of the distro list that we should use. There's certainly information that's extremely important to Clark County that may not be important to other counties. There's stuff that's important to Washoe or Eureka or Elko that isn't necessarily important. But there are things that if we notice trends, and trying to make sure that communication is clear and concise, so that on top of all the other things that you all are dealing with, you're able to see it and understand why we're sending it to you, ends up being extremely important. That's something I'll tell you, I don't always get right. Our team doesn't always get right, but we need feedback, right? If we're sending something to you and it's not effective, or if you're confused as to why, simply encourage you to reach out and let us know so that we can continue to refine that as we move forward. The appropriate means. We've identified that using, a listserv, for example, seems to be a much more effective way than trying to manually keep an email distro list of 80 to 100 emails. There are certainly things that from an urgency standpoint, primaries will email to primaries, right? Whether that's me down to one of the county election officials, or from the secretary to other elected officials, they require urgency. There are things that may, if it applies to your county, again, might warrant a phone call. Part of the importance of, especially on election day, being in the same room at the same time, so that if I get something, I communicate with Erin, she may be able to just look across the table and say, hey, I think this is a you thing. And provide the details for you so that you can act on it. Or if somebody else is doing something, so that we're all aware. Being clear also is part of it. This is something that we take very seriously. Actions on receipt. Is it informational, just so that you're aware? Is it a trend to keep looking out for? Are there other things that we're asking you to do? Oftentimes, what that will result in is actually ongoing communication to the public. Our comms team is, I can say, doubled in size because it's gone from 1 person to 2 people, which is a huge benefit. But our comms team, right across the Secretary of State's office, is already deep into the planning on how do we communicate a wide spectrum of challenges, opportunities, and benefits to voters. So one, that it's not just negative things that we're saying, but also clarifying the positive and the timing, so as reminders, so that people are aware of what's going on. And how do we update that in a way, not that we think is good, but that the voters across our state, whether you're an 18-year-old in Clark County or a 95-year-old in Elko, right? We got to be able to meet the voters where they're at in their communication method. And we'll need your assistance, especially with local partners, to be able to understand the best way to do that. Our feedback loop, again, mentioned this before, but are we capturing the information properly? Are we doing things, from a communication standpoint to the best of our ability? Or are there new means and methods that we can take advantage of to ensure that our communication cycle is reduced, so that you're getting information that's useful to you and timely? We're trying, and we continue to do this. We assess throughout the election cycle, and then also after, how do the Election Integrity Task Force work? What can we be doing differently? We do that across the spectrum for everything from in-person voting to the messaging that we provide. And this is, again, when we talk about how to improve the EITF, your role, your feedback is critical to understanding, our blind spots, and figuring out, what did we do leading up to the primary that, man, we really need to fix before the general, because something could be exploited, or abused or otherwise missed. So the establishment of notification criteria, this is also something that we're continuing to refine. There are certain things, and it goes back to the timely piece, that, frankly, an email will be okay. If you see an email about it, it tells you right off the bat that it's not urgent. But clarifying so that you're aware of what things are we going to call to wake somebody up over, what calls or what emails within 12 hours or even the start of the next business day, again, is also equally important, I think, for you all, as well as the information that we update. How do we distribute it? What can you share? What would we rather you keep close hold? Again, tying that back to our distro lists and the virtual updates that I mentioned earlier on in the presentation. We intend to have those updates so that we're all on the same page. But again, very much need this to be a two-way street and get your feedback. Some feedback we actually got, there's a law enforcement officer, quick reference guide that we had worked with a number of partners to develop a couple election cycles ago. Got some feedback that, at the end of the day, a 2-point font booklet that simply copy and pastes out of statutes, unless you make it like Kevlar, it really isn't useful, right? So don't waste your time printing that. Instead, and again, we got feedback that really kind of a larger size, something that would be kept in an officer's car for them to reference, but not carry out or certainly great. That's exactly the sort of feedback we need. We've had folks ask to provide small group discussions with leadership, again, kind of further down the chain, so that if it's not an individual who maybe necessarily is responding to the polls, but maybe the next supervisor up, to be able to do some Q&A. Any of these things, like the Secretary has said, are on the table and that we eagerly want to support. Part of the reason why we're holding this event here in January and not, the days or hours leading up to the primary or general elections. And then cyber and physical security reviews, something that I know a lot of our counties and cities continue to take very seriously. You're going to hear many of them talk about tabletop exercises, and we'll invite some of you to tabletop exercises. We'll continue to encourage that as well, so that we're all on the same page about responses, what's acceptable, what's not, to get, assumptions out of the way. We're going to continue to train internally our staff. Again, this isn't just an us sitting up on a high horse pointing at everybody else, but there's things that we need to continue to do internally to refine our processes and make sure our staff, especially our new folks, are aware of what is urgent? What does, if you see an email with this, at whatever, like that is an urgent flag for a number of different people in refining those processes. But then also taking the long view approach to it also. As we go through the election cycle, you may come across statutes or regulations that maybe are, I don't say problematic, but have loopholes in them. Identifying that, reporting that up to us so that we're aware and we can include those with the Secretary's policy discussions. I'm not going to say every one of them is going to change, but at least being us aware of those, I think, is an important first step. And understanding that again, from a legal standpoint, our biennial legislative session, again, that becomes the opportunity to address challenges, concerns, to increase security, transparency, and accessibility. And while the policy, of course, piece of it is extremely important, understanding what is a possible issue or concern in a clear, concise manner and what that impact was to voters. Again, if hearing about it just on Facebook doesn't help anybody, but passing it to us so that it can be discussed and addressed is critical. Again, continued refinement, and then ultimately, planning for success. There's a lot going on, but these are absolutely important things that we have to do. Last slide. All right, so the final takeaways here, things to be mindful of. Can't just be focused on election day, right? That as I discussed in the timeline, it starts way earlier than that. And it's something that if you haven't already started getting calls and reports relating to the election cycle, it's coming. We already have, absolutely. Again, being mindful that it's not just kind of one domain, paying strict attention to the litigation. And there's, like I said, a lot of lawsuits that are going on currently. But blindly turning your eye to the cyber or to the other areas of concern is probably not the best practice. Being mindful that things that happen in litigation may cause, again, voter confidence to drop or increase or have these other ripple effects, across the state and our electorate. And while we certainly aren't trying to predict or prevent everything, I think it's extremely important that we have that unified understanding and the collaborative response, right? Which goes back to our communication. Got to have clear, concise communication to and from all of you, so that we're all on the same page. And then finally, right, there's work to be done. Step one was listening to us talk for 2 hours. Arguably, that ain't going to be the hardest thing that you have to do in the coming 12 months as it relates to the election. But we're here as partners. We're here to help support. And again, if you have questions or follow-ups now or later, if you brain dump this before you get to the parking lot, and remember that you want to ask something in September, again, like the Secretary said, we are absolutely here to help support and make sure that collectively we are doing our jobs to make sure that voters can vote. Flat out. That's the desired end state, right? Making sure that voters are aware of their rights and able to execute those rights to vote and have their voices heard in a manner of their choosing. But that being said, very much appreciate your time and attention today. Only 54 slides, not too bad. Any questions before we pause, or questions online? I think at least one person left online. Find out who that is later. Thoughts, questions, nothing inside here. Nothing online. All right, well then we'll belabor the point. Again, like I said, very much appreciate it. I'll shut this off. We'll hang out for a little bit in case there's other questions that you'd rather ask on the side. But again, very much appreciate your time and partnership. Thank you.